Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive where we'll be exploring avian flu.
Yeah,
You've probably seen the headlines about the pig in Oregon that tested positive for H5N1 bird flu.
right,
And you might be thinking, well, should we be concerned?
right.
So today we're going to be digging into some scientific papers and also some recent news reports
Yeah, that sounds great.
to kind of get a better understanding of what's going on.
It's certainly a topic that deserves our attention.
So to start off, can you give us like a simple explanation of avian influenza? Like, what is it?
So avian influenza or bird flu is a type of influenza A virus.
Okay.
And that type A is important because it means that this virus has the potential to infect a variety of different species, including birds and mammals.
Bless you.
And the natural reservoir for these viruses is aquatic birds. So your ducks, your geese, your swans.
So they're kind of just carrying it around without really getting sick?
Right. Most avian influenza viruses are what we call low pathogenicity, meaning they cause mild or no symptoms in birds. But there's a small subset, particularly some H5 and H7 subtypes, that are highly pathogenic,
Okay.
meaning they can cause severe disease and even death in birds. And the subtype that we're most concerned about right now is H5N1.
That's the one that's causing all the fess right now.
Right.
But birds aren't the only ones that can get infected, right? I
That's
mean, we've
true.
seen cases of it spilling over into mammals and even people.
You're absolutely right. And this is where things start to get a bit concerning.
Okay.
These influenza viruses are constantly evolving. They're like tiny little shapeshifters, always looking for a new host to infect.
And that's what makes it so tricky, right? Because
Yeah.
they can jump from one species to another
Right.
and potentially create these new strains that are easier to transmit.
Exactly.
It's like that game of telephone that we used to play as kids where you whisper a message and it gets all jumbled up along the way.
That's a great analogy.
Sometimes the message at the end is barely recognizable.
Right.
And it seems like the same thing can happen with these viruses.
Absolutely. As they jump between species, they can pick up new genetic material,
Wow.
essentially creating a brand new virus.
So that brings us to this idea of mixing vessels. And you mentioned pigs earlier.
Yes.
And I know that they can be infected by both avian and human flu viruses.
Exactly. Pigs have this unique characteristic where their cells have receptors for both avian and human influenza viruses. So it's like having two different locks on their doors that both the avian and human flu keys can fit into,
Oh, wow. I see.
making them susceptible to a wider range of flu viruses and increasing the chances of those viruses mingling and swapping genes.
So if a pig gets infected with both a bird flu and a human flu, it's like they can have a little party inside the pig cells
Right.
and create this brand new, potentially more dangerous strain.
Exactly. And this process called reassortment is how some of the most devastating flu pandemics in history have emerged.
And that's where things get really interesting and a little scary.
Yes.
I mean, think about the 1918 flu pandemic, the one that killed millions of people worldwide. It's suspected to have originated in pigs.
Yes.
And the 2009 swine flu pandemic
Yes, that one too.
also came from pigs. So it seems like they've played a pretty significant role in the evolution and spread of these viruses.
They certainly have.
And this brings us back to that pig in Oregon.
Right.
The fact that it got infected with H5N1 is concerning.
It definitely raises some red flags.
It tells us that this avian flu is circulating in mammal populations, and it has the potential to mix with other flu viruses
Right?
and maybe even create a new strain that's better at infecting humans.
Exactly.
So this isn't just about a single pig getting sick. This is about the possibility of this virus evolving in ways that could make it a much bigger threat to human health.
You've hit the nail on the head.
And we're seeing more cases of H5N1 infecting mammals around the world.
Right. Which only amplifies these concerns.
So we've established that the pig case is pretty concerning, but we also know the avian flu can infect humans.
Yes.
But you said earlier that it's not easy. Can you explain why that is?
Absolutely. It all comes down to those receptors on the surface of our cells. Avian flu viruses are specifically adapted to bind to a type of receptor that's common in birds' respiratory tracts.
Okay.
Think of it like a key fitting into a lock. These receptors are slightly different in humans, so the avian flu virus has a harder time attaching and getting inside our cells.
So it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
That's a great analogy.
It just doesn't quite work.
Exactly. And to get a bit more technical, these receptors are called sialic acid galactose linkages. Human respiratory cells mostly have receptors with an A2XX linkage, while bird flu prefers ATA 2/3 linkages.
Okay, so it's possible for avian flu to infect humans,
Right.
but it's not super efficient because the virus just isn't really designed to attach to our cells.
Precisely.
But here's the thing, viruses mutate all the time.
Right.
And even a tiny change in their genetic makeup can change their ability to bind to different receptors.
Exactly.
So there's a chance that H5N1 could mutate in a way that makes it easier for it to infect human cells.
That's the concern.
Okay, so to recap, we have this virus that's circulating in bird populations.
Yes.
It's shown that it can jump to mammals, including pigs.
Yeah.
And pigs can act as these mixing vessels for new strains.
Yes.
And on top of all that, this virus has the potential to mutate in ways that could make it more transmissible to humans.
Right.
That's a lot to take in.
It certainly is. And the scale of this current H5N1 outbreak adds another layer of complexity.
Right. This isn't just a few isolated cases.
No, not at all.
This outbreak is massive.
It's the largest on record in both Europe and North America.
Wow.
We're talking about millions of birds, over 58 million in Europe and almost 60 million in the U.S. that have either died from the virus or been culled to prevent its spread.
And it's not just chickens and turkeys that are affected, right?
No, not at all. It's
Yeah.
impacting a huge range of bird species, from ducks and geese to eagles and vultures. And what's particularly concerning is that we're seeing a growing number of mammals getting infected as well.
Oh, wow. Like what kind of mammals?
We're talking about badgers, bears, bobcats, coyotes, dolphins, ferrets, foxes, leopards. The list goes on.
That's a lot of different species. So this virus is already circulating in both bird and mammal populations.
Yes.
And that's definitely concerning.
Absolutely. It's a clear indication that this is a situation that demands our attention.
So one thing I wanted to touch on is the outbreak on that mink farm in Spain.
Right.
It wasn't just a few minks getting sick. This was something different, right?
You're right. The mink farm outbreak in October of 2022 was especially alarming because it provided evidence of sustained mammal-to-mammal transmission of H5N1. And that's something we haven't seen often with this virus.
So they weren't just getting infected from birds, they were actually spreading it to each other.
That's what the evidence suggests.
And that raises concerns about the possibility of H5N1 adapting to become more easily transmissible among mammals, including us.
Absolutely.
And then there was the seal outbreak, too, in the summer of 2022 in New England.
Yes.
That also pointed to mammal-to-mammal transmission, right?
It did. While more research is needed to fully understand the dynamics of that outbreak, scientists believe it's likely that H5N1 was transmitted between those harbor and gray seals through respiratory droplets.
Wow.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Some of the infected seals even exhibited neurological symptoms.
Oh, wow. Neurological symptoms. That's scary. It makes you wonder what else this virus is capable of.
It certainly does.
So with all of these developments, the big question is H5N1 mutating in a way that makes it more easily transmissible between humans?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something scientists are actively investigating. We know that viruses are constantly evolving, and H5N1 is no exception.
Well, this is all a bit unsettling. But before we spiral into a panic, let's talk about what we can do to prepare for a potential pandemic. What steps can people, communities, and governments take to mitigate the risks?
That's a great question, and it's one that deserves a thorough discussion.
Well, let's dive into that in part 2 of our deep dives. Stay tuned.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge that we're not starting from scratch.
Right.
We learned a lot from past pandemics, including the COVID-19 pandemic, about the importance of preparedness.
That's a good point. We saw firsthand how quickly a new virus can spread and disrupt our lives. So what are some of the key lessons we can apply to the current situation with avian flu?
Well, one of the most important takeaways from COVID-19 is the critical role of surveillance. We need robust systems in place to track the spread of H5N1 in both animal and human populations.
So basically, we need to be on the lookout for any unusual patterns of illness or death in animals, especially birds.
Exactly.
And quickly investigate any suspected cases of H5N1 in humans.
Right, and this surveillance needs to happen on a global scale. We can't just focus on countries where H5N1 is already widespread.
Right.
This virus doesn't respect borders, so we need a coordinated global effort to track its movements.
That makes sense. What about vaccines? I know there's been a lot of talk about developing an H5N1 vaccine for humans. Where do we stand on that front?
There are some H5N1 vaccines that have been developed, and the U.S. even has a stockpile of H5N1 vaccine antigen and adjuvant.
Okay.
But the challenge with influenza viruses is that they're constantly evolving. So a vaccine that's effective against one strain might not be as effective against a newer mutated strain.
So it's kind of like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly.
Always changing.
That's why research is so crucial. We need to invest in developing new and improved vaccines that can provide broader protection against a wider range of H5N1 strains, ideally even a universal flu vaccine that could protect against all influenza viruses.
That would be amazing. But until we have that, what else can we do to prepare?
Public health measures are also essential. We need effective communication campaigns to educate the public about avian flu, how it spreads, and what steps people can take to protect themselves.
Right. Knowledge is power. The more people know about H5N1, the less likely they are to panic, and the more likely they are to take precautions. What kind of things should we be telling people?
Well, for starters, we need to emphasize the importance of basic hygiene practices like frequent hand washing, especially after handling poultry or coming into contact with birds. And if you're feeling sick, especially if you have respiratory symptoms, it's important to stay home and avoid contact with others to prevent spreading the virus. These are all things we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they apply just as much to avian flu.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that a lot of the lessons we learned during COVID-19 are relevant to pandemic preparedness in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we also need to consider some more specific measures, particularly for people who work in close contact with animals, like those in poultry farms, live animal markets, or wildlife rescue centers.
Right. Those folks are really on the front lines, so to speak. What can they do to protect themselves?
Strict biosecurity protocols are essential for these workers. This includes things like wearing personal protective equipment like masks and gloves, properly disinfecting equipment and surfaces, and limiting contact with potentially infected animals.
It makes sense minimizing the risk of exposure.
Exactly. And this is where government agencies like the CDC and the USDA have a crucial role to play in providing guidance and support to these industries.
Okay, so we've got surveillance vaccine development and public health measures. What else is crucial in terms of pandemic preparedness?
Well, all of these efforts require significant resources, and that's where funding comes in. We need sustained investment in research to develop new and improved vaccines, antivirals, and diagnostic tools, and we need to support the public health infrastructure that's essential for effective surveillance and response.
I completely agree. If we want to be prepared for a potential avian flu pandemic, research is essential.
It is.
We need to understand this virus so we can develop effective ways to counter it. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that there's still a lot we don't know about H5N1.
You're absolutely right. There are still many unanswered questions, and that's why ongoing research is so critical. One area that needs further investigation is the role of wild animals in the spread of H5N1. We need to know more about which species are susceptible to infection, how the virus spreads among them, and what kinds of mutations are emerging in these animal populations.
Yeah, I remember reading a quote from a professor at Tufts University who's been studying the seal outbreak, and he stressed the need for more funding for wild animal surveillance. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that we don't fully understand what's circulating out there in these animals and how it might jump to humans.
He makes a very important point. We can't just focus on domestic animals. Wild animals play a crucial role in the ecology of influenza viruses, and we need to understand their role in transmission dynamics if we want to effectively control the spread of H5N1.
Another area where we need more research is in understanding how H5N1 affects humans.
Right.
We know it can cause severe respiratory illness,
Yes.
but we still don't fully understand why some people get so sick while others experience only mild symptoms.
Right, and we need to investigate the potential for long-term health consequences of H5N1 infection. We know that some viruses like COVID-19 can have long-lasting effects on various organ systems, and it's possible that H5N1 could also have lingering effects.
And of course, we need to continue monitoring the virus for any signs of adaptation that could make it more easily transmissible between humans. This is where genomic surveillance becomes absolutely critical.
Absolutely. By sequencing the genomes of H5N1 viruses collected from both animals and humans, we can track the emergence of mutations in real time and identify any changes that might signal an increased risk to human health. This kind of surveillance is essential for informing our prevention and control strategies.
It seems like there's a whole network of interconnected areas where research is needed: virology, immunology, epidemiology, ecology, even animal behavior.
You've hit the nail on the head addressing a complex global health threat. Like avian influenza requires a multidisciplinary approach. We need experts from various fields working together to share knowledge, resources, and expertise.
So what does this all mean for the average person? I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by all this information and feel powerless.
Right.
What can individuals do to contribute to preparedness efforts?
That's a really important question. I think the first step is to stay informed, keep up with the latest developments, not just through sensationalized headlines, but by seeking out reliable sources of information from reputable organizations like the WHO, the CDC, and trusted scientific publications.
And I think it's important to remember that we're not just passive recipients of information. We can also be active advocates for change.
Absolutely. Individuals can contact their elected officials to advocate for increased funding for avian flu research and pandemic preparedness programs.
And we can support organizations that are working on the front lines of this issue.
Yes.
Whether it's through donations or volunteering our time.
Exactly.
Another way to contribute is to just talk about avian flu with your family, friends, and colleagues. Raising awareness and promoting informed discussions can help to dispel misinformation and encourage proactive behaviors.
I think that's a great point. It's easy to feel helpless when faced with a global challenge, but even small actions can have a ripple effect.
So true. By staying informed, advocating for change, and taking personal responsibility for our health and the health of our communities, we can all play a role in building a more resilient future.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to our deep dive on avian flu.
So we've talked about the virus itself, the current outbreak, and the importance of being prepared. But I'm curious about this idea of being proactive when it comes to preparing for pandemics. Like, what would that even look like?
It's a really great question, and one that requires us to think big, and really challenge how we do things. Imagine a world where instead of just reacting to outbreaks after they've already started, we're actively looking for potential threats, and we're taking steps to try and stop them before they become a huge problem.
So it's like thinking ahead and anticipating problems before they happen.
Yeah, exactly. Like when you prepare for hurricane season,
Oh, yeah.
you board up your windows and stock up on supplies before the storm actually hits.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And when it comes to avian flu, one of the most important things we can do is really improve our animal surveillance systems worldwide. We need to be keeping a close eye on both birds and mammals, looking for any sign of the virus, tracking how it's changing, and making sure that information is shared quickly with everyone.
That reminds me of what you said earlier about taking a more holistic approach.
Right.
You can't just be about domestic animals.
Right. Yeah. We need to look at wild animals, too, and understand their role in spreading these viruses.
It's all about understanding how human health, animal health, and the environment are all connected.
Exactly. It's a One Health approach, recognizing that the health of humans, animals, and the environment are all intertwined.
And speaking of connections, another important part of being proactive is investing in research to develop a universal flu vaccine.
Absolutely. That's the holy grail.
It would be incredible.
A vaccine that could protect against a wide variety of flu strains, including those with pandemic potential. It would be a game changer, and while it's a really complex challenge, it's definitely possible.
I mean, we've seen some amazing advancements in vaccine technology recently.
We have?
So it makes you feel hopeful.
It does.
Imagine the impact a universal flu vaccine could have, not only in preventing pandemics, but also just in reducing the burden of regular seasonal flu.
Absolutely. It would be a huge win for public health.
But even while we're working on that, there are other things we can do to reduce the risks, like rethinking how we farm poultry on a large scale.
You're right. Those massive farms with thousands of birds crammed together,
Yeah.
they create the perfect conditions for viruses to spread. It's like a breeding ground for disease.
Yeah, it is.
We need to look into more sustainable and humane ways of farming that prioritize the well-being of the animals and reduce the chances of diseases spreading. This could involve things like having smaller flocks, giving birds access to the outdoors, and improving biosecurity measures.
And it's not just about protecting ourselves from avian flu. These changes would be good for the animals too, and reduce the need for antibiotics in livestock, which is another big public health concern. So win-win.
I completely agree. And speaking of win-win situations, investing in pandemic preparedness isn't just about preventing outbreaks. It's about making our public health systems stronger and building resilience in our communities.
That's so important. It's about being ready for any health challenge, whether it's a new disease, a natural disaster, or even something like climate change, which is already affecting our health.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where we're not constantly in crisis mode, but where we're prepared to adapt and thrive even when things are uncertain.
That's a really powerful vision, and it makes me think that this isn't just about governments and big institutions.
Right.
It's about all of us doing our part.
Absolutely. It's about individuals taking responsibility for their health, making informed decisions, and supporting policies that promote well-being. It's about communities helping each other and being resilient, and it's about global cooperation, sharing knowledge and resources to create a safer and healthier world for everyone.
Well said. That's a perfect way to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's been incredibly informative, and I hope it's encouraged you to join in on these conversations and take a more proactive approach to preparing for pandemics. Remember, knowledge is power, and by working together, we can create a future where we're not just surviving, but thriving. Thanks for joining us.